I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. Well, hi, and welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And we greatly appreciate you joining us today. You know, Billy, today we actually have a topic on that's one of our viewers requested. So we do that.
I know, that's a great point. And, you know, I'm so excited for today's topics. We've got two great speakers. But first, thank you all for being with us. If you're joining us via Zoom, you can use the chat function to interact with us. If you're on Facebook Live, you can use the comment section. And if you happen to be watching a YouTube video of us, you can interact with us through ukforestry.org. So again, thank you all for being here. But Renee, two great topics, right? You know,
yes.
We got Dr. Wendell Haig with the U.S. Forest Service. He's also an adjunct faculty member here at the Department of Forestry, and he's going to be talking about mussels. And believe it or not, we've got a lot of mussels.
A lot of mussels.
Not necessarily these,
this guy.
But there are lots of mussels and really cool stuff that he's working on. Really important stuff as well, you know. So I'm really excited about Wendell's. Actually had a chance to preview some of the stuff he's going to.
It's so neat. Such a neat topic.
Yeah, so folks, make sure you get ready for these because it's really cool. And then a reoccurring guest who we love having on often, Dr. Jonathan Larson, a UK entomologist. He's going to be talking about something that we all need to be watching out for, right?
Yes,
unfortunately. But, you know, fortunately, we got Dr. Larson there to help guide us through all of this stuff. So again, thank you all for being with us. And I guess, you know, Renee, if you're ready.
All right. So Wendell, if you don't mind turning on your video, we'll get started.
I'm here. Hello, Billy.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah. You're very welcome. It's nice to be with you.
So tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about today.
Well, I'm going to tell you about freshwater mussels. I'm going to take you out in the creek, and we're going to just talk about mussels in Kentucky, and we're going to look at a few. And we'll go back into the office briefly or into the lab, and I'll show you a few other interesting things about mussels, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let's go ahead.
I have to give kind of a shout out or two here to start with. I'd like to thank both you and Billy and Ellen Crocker, who helped me do my video here, and especially my daughter, Lila Grace, who's a junior in high school and who patiently sat through this and edited it with me. If she didn't help me, I would have been lost. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. Our children are amazing. Yeah, appreciate the whole team. We always say around here,
it's a team.
Yes.
It's a team effort.
It's definitely a team effort.
Yes.
All right. So let's go ahead and watch that wonderful video that she created.
All right. And then we'll bring Dr. Haig back here in just a few moments. So, all right, we'll get it started.
I'm here at Elkhorn Creek near Frankfort. It's a beautiful day. All the trees are leafing out. There's lots of migrant birds coming through, lots of warblers and things like that. I'm going to tell you about a part of the natural world in Kentucky that you may not know as much about. If you've ever spent any time on a river or a creek in Kentucky, you've probably found shells, or you might have found shells. Well, these are freshwater mussels, or clams, or bivalves, or whatever you want to call them. A lot of people don't even know that we have clams or shells in freshwater in Kentucky. I remember as a kid being amazed the first time I found mussel shells in a creek. I thought you had to go to the ocean or the beach to find shells, and I was really surprised that we have shells and mussels here in Kentucky in our own backyard. Not only does Kentucky have mussels, but we've got one of the highest mussel diversities of anywhere on Earth. There's about 300 mussel species in all of North America, but the vast majority of those occur in the eastern part of the U.S., especially in the southeast. So the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia each have over 100 mussel species. This is more than in the Amazon or the Congo or other rivers and tropical regions that we normally associate with higher biodiversity. Just for example, in the entire Ohio River Basin, which includes most of Kentucky, there's about 400 fish species. but in the Amazon River Basin, there's over 3,000 fish species. But that's not the case with freshwater mussels. Here in Kentucky, we're actually in the rainforest when it comes to freshwater mussel diversity. So freshwater mussels are a really extraordinary part of our natural heritage here in Kentucky. This part of Elkhorn Creek here has about 20 mussel species. So just to put that in context for you in another way, the entire continent of Europe has only about 15 mussel species. So if I were to spend an hour or so really looking around carefully here, I could find more mussel species in this one little area than in all of Europe. And in some of the larger streams in Kentucky, like the Licking or the Green, you can find 30 or 40 species or more in one little area like this. So I think that's pretty extraordinary. But just another example of how extraordinary our mussel fauna is here in a global context. So I've talked about their high diversity, but mussels are also important ecologically. Mussels are filter feeders, so they pump water into their bodies, they extract oxygen and food and pump it back out. The way this works is when they pump the water into their bodies, it passes across their gills, and their gills are like a fine mesh, and so that filters out all the particles in the water, most of the particles, so things like algae, sediment particles, etc. So they don't necessarily eat all this stuff. They have kind of an interesting and elaborate way of picking out the stuff that they like. And the rest of the stuff, they expel it out onto the bottom of the stream. So you might think this sounds kind of gross, like mussels are expelling all this gunk out on the bottom of the stream, but it's really not like that. And that stuff is really important. By taking that material out of the water in suspension and putting it into the bottom, it becomes available for all the animals that live in the bottom of the stream. So it becomes a food source for microorganisms, insects, crayfish or crawdads, and all these other critters in the bottom of the stream. Those animals in turn are a food source for fishes, game fishes, and other things. So mussels are really an integral part of the ecosystem in a healthy stream, at least in this part of the world. Well, let's go look for some mussels. There's a couple of ways that we do this. Mussels can be kind of inconspicuous and hard to find because they live most of their lives buried almost completely in the bottom of a stream. So if this is the top, if this is the bottom of the stream and all the gravel and everything's under here, mussels will typically be buried almost all the way with just the tip of the shell poking out like this. Just enough that they can access the water overhead for filter feeding. Probably the most effective way of finding mussels is to put on a mask and snorkel and get down in the river. But it's the end of April, the water is still kind of chilly, and so I've got my waders on here. An almost equally effective way of finding mussels if the water's not too deep is with a bucket like this. So this is just a regular 5-gallon bucket. I've cut the bottom out and I've put a piece of clear plexiglass in there, glued it in there, sealed it with some silicone, and you can push this down into the water and it cuts the glare off the surface and you can look down at the bottom of the creek. So let's head out and see what we can find. So I found a few, thank goodness. So here's one called a 3-ridge. You can see it's got these really interesting ridges on the shell. This one's all covered with algae and stuff. And there's these little cases on the shell. These are the cases of a caddisfly, an insect larvae. So that's another important ecological role of mussels, is that their shells, they provide habitat for a lot of other animals. So I also found a mussel called a spike. It's kind of a pretty shell here. These get big, maybe, about that long. And I found another thing that we really like to see. I found a few baby mussels, and this is important because a lot of streams, they don't have a lot of recruitment or a lot of reproduction, it seems like. Mostly what you, find are big old adult mussels, and there doesn't seem like there's much coming in to replace them. So it's kind of like a forest where there's no young trees coming up in the forest floor. But I found a baby spike here, like the one I showed you a minute ago. And here's a couple of other baby pocketbooks. So these individuals here, they probably were born last year in the summer. And so they're just starting out on their first full year of life. So it's nice to see these little babies. Here's another thing I found. In past episodes on this show, you've had people talk about all the invasive plants in forests. Well, we actually have invasive bivalves also here in Kentucky. This is a thing called an Asian clam. These arrived in Kentucky in the mid-60s, early 60s, and they're now one of the most ubiquitous bivalves across the whole state. They're the dominant bivalves in many streams. So you can tell these apart from native mussels because the Asian clams have these strong concentric ridges on the shell. I can't focus on it, but if you run your fingernail across it, there's these strong ridges. So people often get excited. They say they found freshwater mussels in a creek, but it's often these Asian clams. And like I said, they're pretty common across the whole state.
Well, that was a great video, Wendell. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. And I have to commend your daughter on the great job that she did, as well as you as the star of that.
Okay. Well, I wanted to bring you into the lab here for a minute and tell you about the mussel life cycle, because it's really amazing and sort of bizarre in some ways. 30 years ago, if people thought about mussels at all, they thought, well, they're diverse and they've got pretty shells and all this, but they don't really do much exciting. When I was a student, an undergraduate in college, and was first getting interested in mussels, one of my big mentors at that time asked me one day, he said, "Why do you want to study mussels? They don't do anything." And this was the conception at that time. But since that time, we've discovered all these crazy things that mussels do, and I want to tell you about that. So their life cycle, it starts out somewhat ordinary. The female mussels, they produce eggs, and they hold these eggs in their gills. At about the same time, the males release their sperm into the water, and it drifts with the current. And the females encounter that sperm as they're filter feeding. They bring the sperm in and they fertilize their eggs. And so far, this is not too unusual. It's kind of the same way that oak trees do their things, right? The male flowers, the pollen blows off the male flowers and it lands on the female flowers. But after this, it gets increasingly unusual. So when the eggs are fertilized, they hatch into these larvae called a glaucidium. So these larvae, they've got two shells like the adults, but they don't yet have any of the organs or the structures that an adult mussel has, like the gills or foot or any of that stuff. And they come in all shapes and sizes, but in general, these things are just barely visible with the naked eye. So they average about a quarter of a millimeter across, and you can probably fit 3 or 4 or a half dozen on the tip of a pencil. So the unusual thing about these larvae is that they're parasites. They attach onto the gills or to the fins of usually a fish. And the fish tissue, it grows around them and kind of encapsulates them. And while they're on the fish like this, they extract energy and nutrients out of the fish blood and tissues. And they use this energy to undergo a complete anatomical metamorphosis or a transformation. And kind of like when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly. They live on the fish for about 2 to 4 weeks usually. They usually don't harm the fish. For the fish, it's more just kind of an annoyance, like having a tick or lice or something. But after about 2 or 4 weeks, they fall off the fish. And at that point, they have grown all those things that, most of the things that adult mussels have, like the gills and the foot and all this. And after about 2 to 3 months, after falling off the fish, they start to look like miniature versions of the adults, like the spike I showed you out in Elkhorn Creek there. Some species can live over 50 years. And so once they drop off the fish, they live out the rest of their life just kind of minding their own business, filter feeding, and occasionally hassling the fish like this. But another interesting part of this mussel and fish relationship is that most mussel species can only use a certain kind of fish. And so in other words, their larvae can only develop or make that transformation on a certain kind of fish. For example, there's a group of species that can only use bass, or their larvae can only transform on bass. If they wind up on a different fish species, those larvae will die. There's another group of mussels that their larvae only can transform on minnows. Other species only use catfishes, and so on. So it might occur to you that mussels have a problem here. They live most of their lives buried in the bottom of a river. So how do they get their larvae, these tiny almost microscopic larvae on a fish? And not only that, how do they get them on the right kind of fish? Well, that's where it gets really interesting. That group of mussels I mentioned a minute ago, whose larvae can only transform on bass, they have these elaborate modifications of part of their body that acts as a lure. So it's just like a lure that you'd use if you were bass fishing. So this one here, it's an incredible mimic of a small fish. It's got an eye spot. It has a tail. It's got fins, all this. This one here is a perfect mimic of a crawfish. Here's another one here with the fish lure. I don't know what these two things are supposed to look like, but they're big lures that attract big predator fish like bass. And I told you earlier how the female holds her eggs in her gills. Well, after they hatch into larvae, she continues holding those larvae in her gills. And these things here, these pouches, are the gills. And that's going to be important here in a minute. So here's a video just to show you how this works. Come on, video. Here you go. Okay. So this is another one of those mussel species whose larvae have to be on bass in order to complete their development. So here's these lures, and you can see they flap these lures, and those minnows that are swimming around. Note how much those lures resemble a minnow. It has an eye. It's got the stripe, just like these minnows. Now these minnows are not going to try to attack this lure because it's as big as they are, and so that helps to reduce the probability that these larvae are going to end up on a minnow on which they would die. So they'll flap these lures like this for weeks or months until a bass eventually comes along. And here's that gill pouch again that's packed full of larvae. So here's one of these mussels in an aquarium displaying its lure. See, it looks just like a minnow. Here's the gill pouch here. One of these bass is going to come along and get interested in this. It's going to think it's going to get a meal. Well, instead of getting a meal, what it's done is it's torn open that gill pouch. That will heal eventually, but it's liberated those larvae out into the stream, and a lot of them have ended up on the gills of that fish. So I mentioned there's also a group of mussel species that need a minnow. That's all that they can use. So minnows, they typically live up in the water. They feed on things that are drifting in the current, like insect larvae, small worms, or leeches, things like this. These mussels don't have a big lure like that because they don't want to attract a bass. They want to attract a minnow. So they release their larvae in these little packets. They're a couple of millimeters long or so, and they look like little worms or leeches or something, but they contain all these mussel larvae. So when they release these, they sort of shoot them up into the water. They drift with the current, and the minnows gobble them up, and the life cycle is completed. So there's another group of mussel species whose larvae can only develop on darters. Darters are a group of small fishes, an inch or two long. They're very brightly colored. They live on the bottom of the stream, and they forage amongst the rocks and the pebbles and stuff for aquatic insects and other things. So these mussels, they also don't have a big lure because they don't want to attract a bass, but they also don't want their larvae up in the stream where the minnows might eat them. So they produce these little packages also, but these packages, they fall onto the bottom, and many of them are actually adhesive. They adhere onto the rocks and stuff down on the bottom where they're less conspicuous to the minnows, but the darters have a good chance of finding them. And here's a darter that gets gobbled one up here. This mussel species, it produces a thing that's kind of like a worm, and it waves it around, but it holds it down on the bottom, and the darters come and gobble it up. So here's a few more of these packets. These things are just amazing mimics. And if you found a thing like this in a creek, you'd just say, well, that's some sort of a bug. And in fact, this is a dead mimic for an insect larvae, a black fly, pupa actually. Here's one here that looks like some type of an insect larvae. These look like a larval fish. There's some earthworm mimics, and these look like fish eggs. A lot of darters eat fish eggs. So all these things are actually packets with a membrane that encloses, they're just packed full of these mussel larvae. When a darter comes up, tries to eat one, squeezes it, it pops open, all these larvae go out and attach on its gills. So here's one of the most amazing and bizarre ways that mussels get their larvae onto their hosts. So this mussel also is a specialist on darters, but it doesn't make those packets. Instead, it's got a little tiny lure that's hard to make out in this video, but it's sort of two little filaments that sort of look like the tail filaments of an insect larvae, like a mayfly. So it waves those filaments. A darter comes along and it tries to eat this mayfly, but instead the clam clamps down on its nose. So it holds it here and the fish can't get loose. And while it's holding it, if you'll watch, this mussel will start to sort of flex its valves. What it's doing is it's actually pumping those larvae in the fish's mouth and out over its gills where they can attach. And if you look here, you see a few of the larvae that are kind of falling out. So here's another one. This mussel also has one of those little tiny lures. It looks like the tail filaments of an insect. You see them here. So the darter comes up, tries to get a meal, but instead gets trapped by the mussel. The mussel holds the fish here, and they can hold them for as much as 20 or 30 minutes. And during this time, it's pumping its larvae all over this fish. You see a bunch of these larvae, they're spilling out here. This fish is kind of curious to see how colorful these darters are. But it holds it a period of time, and eventually this mussel is going to open its shell, and the fish is kind of dazed, but it's usually unharmed. It swims off, and it's going to come back around. And instead of getting a meal, you can see that this fish got coated with these mussel larvae. So just a very effective way of getting their larvae on fish and on the right kind of fish. So I wanted to show you this to show you that mussels do all kinds of cool stuff, and there's just lots and lots of interesting things happening below the surface of the water out there in our streams. So at this point, Billy or Renee, if you could just play the rest of the video.
We will get it going.
So I hope by now I've convinced you that mussels are fascinating and important and just plain cool. The sad thing about mussels is that they're disappearing in many places. Of the 300 North American species, almost 100 are listed as endangered or threatened, and about another 100 are in trouble at some level. So about 2/3 of our mussel fauna is in trouble. If you recall earlier, I told you that this part of Elkhorn Creek here has about 20 mussel species now. Well, 50 years ago, there were 25 or 30 species, maybe even a few more. So even though there's still a lot of mussels here, we've lost a substantial portion of the fauna that ought to be here. And this is the case across Kentucky. Almost all streams in the state have lost a substantial portion of the fauna that was there originally. What's even more concerning is that other streams have lost their mussel fauna almost entirely. For example, a stream where I've worked a lot in Jackson and Rockcastle counties, in the last 25 years, mussel abundance in that stream has declined about 98%. That stream originally had about 23 mussel species, including 2 endangered species, which at that time, the populations of those 2 species in the creek were about the largest left on Earth. Well, now there's about 2 or 3 species just barely hanging on in this creek. Those 2 endangered species appear to be gone, and mussels are just almost entirely eliminated in the creek. We're seeing this in other places, other parts of the Rockcastle River system, the Noland River, parts of the Green River system, out in western Kentucky, in the Little River and the Red River. So remember, when we lose mussels in a stream, we also lose all those important ecosystem benefits that they provide. Unfortunately, we don't know why mussels are disappearing or dying out in these streams. So that's a big part of my job. I and people in other states, other countries, are trying to understand why mussels are disappearing in some places and why streams like Elkhorn Creek here have lost a part of their mussel fauna. So we hope that if we can understand better what the causes of these mussel declines are, land managers, whether it's the U.S. Forest Service or Kentucky Fish and Wildlife or other agencies and organizations, we hope they can use that information to correct the problem and to restore populations of mussels in our streams.
Well, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much for that. And it made me think, you were talking about how the mussels are declining, and I know some fish are also declining. So do you think that has a correlation between the two?
Well, that's an excellent question. I get that question a lot, and I like to hear it because I know people are paying attention if they ask that question. That would be a cool story. if that was what was happening.
Mhm.
Because I told you how the mussels are dependent on having, certain kinds of fish. There's two or three examples in North America of a mussel population disappearing because its host fish has disappeared. And these are exceptions, though. There are mussel species that are specialists on like a migratory fish, like a sturgeon or a herring, and dams have interrupted their spawning migrations. And so the mussels and their hosts have disappeared. But in the vast majority of cases, these streams where we're seeing these mussel declines, the fish fauna is intact. So all the fish are there. The stream I talked about in Jackson County, all the fish are there, all the insects are there, all the other animals are there. And that just adds to the mystery of why the mussels are disappearing. So it's a great question, but unfortunately, it doesn't appear like that's the case.
Okay.
Wendell, I was wondering when you'd mentioned the diversity compared to the Elkhorn, compared to Europe, it really kind of blew my mind. Do you have a sense, or do we know what that original diversity in Europe was through fossil records or anything? I mean, was it like comparable to here, or?
No. That 15 species was probably the original, fauna of Europe. It's just that part of the world was less diverse in terms of mussels, and it's less diverse in other things too. Part of that is because of the glacial history, of Europe. A lot of that area, like the northern part of the U.S., was sort of wiped clean by the glaciers. But it's just a complex, sort of biogeographic history of those areas. So
I'm assuming you should not go out and look for mussels then, or
well,
is that okay?
I think people can do that. I always encourage people to get out and enjoy and experience all the natural wonders in Kentucky. And there's no more pleasant way to spend a hot day in the summer than with a mask and snorkel in the streams and just looking at this whole world that's present under the surface there, the fish, the insects, and the mussels. So yeah, I think people, they can certainly go out and look at mussels, but there's one thing that they need to be conscious of. We have a lot of endangered species in Kentucky. So these are protected by law. So, just like a bald eagle, it's illegal to disturb or to harass these species in any way. And that extends also to their shells. It's illegal to possess a part of an endangered species, including their shell. So, but most of the endangered species are kind of uncommon in Kentucky, or rare. But people ought to just maybe check with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife to see what kind of restrictions are in place against bothering mussels, or you would never want to harvest any live ones or take them. You can just look at them and appreciate them in place. But I think people like to get out and in the streams and experience that.
Yeah.
We did have a question. Someone asked if they have a stream, what can they do to help? And other than normal protection from pollution and such, can they be introduced into streams, or should they not do that?
Well, excellent questions. I'll answer the first part first. With respect to what landowners or other people can do to help mussels, I have to just emphasize the thing I said in the presentation is that we don't know why mussels are disappearing in streams. So because of that, it's hard to give real specific guidance for people. But landowners in general, there's a lot of things that they can do to just increase the health and the integrity of the stream in general. And those things are going to be good for all the animals and plants in the stream. For example, y'all have had people on your show in the past talking about buffer strips, right, along streams. Those are essential, just leaving a strip of land 30, 50 feet or whatever, where it's got kind of intact, undisturbed vegetation, especially trees and shrubs with extensive root systems. Those help to hold the banks in place. They help the banks to be more stable, and these just have positive benefits to streams in general. So whether or not that's a factor in mussel declines and can help to turn them around, we don't know, but it can't hurt. Like I said, it has positive benefits on streams. Another thing is unrestricted livestock access in streams is a problem. Cows can really do a lot of damage in the stream. So if landowners can reduce or limit access of livestock in the stream, that helps too. And there's a lot of incentive and assistance type programs available out there that can help landowners do that, and also with the buffer strips. So I'm sure that y'all can turn people on those resources.
I would remind folks that, if you're not already working with some professional natural resource professionals, please do so. And amongst those is the Kentucky Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they have programs such as EQIP, their Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and other programs that can do those very things that Wendell was talking about. So get to know your local natural resource professional, inquire about those programs, and do your part to try to help make Kentucky as diverse and natural as we can be.
Yeah. So the other part of that question is a really important one too, asking whether or not mussels can be reintroduced into streams. And yes, they can. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife has a large program where they're doing just that. For some of these rare mussel species, they're bringing them into their facility, and they can actually, replicate that life cycle of the mussel in their facility. They put the proper fish species in. They often will kind of artificially inoculate the fish with the larvae out of those mussels, and they can produce thousands of baby mussels. So they're using those to try to restore populations that have disappeared. But that's the thing that is pretty highly regulated, and that ought to be left entirely to the agencies who have the authority to do that. And individuals ought to never take it upon themselves to move mussels around, because there's problems with moving pathogens around, or accidentally introducing species into a stream where they're not native. There's just all kinds of problems. So it definitely is an important conservation tool, but it's something that ought to be left to the agencies who have that authority.
Well, thank you, Wendell. This was an excellent presentation, and we appreciate you being here. I learned a lot.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, I was going to say, you showed our viewers a part of Kentucky that they probably haven't seen, or very few have seen. So for that, thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad. That was my goal. Thanks, Billy and Renee. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Very good. We'll have you back again.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So moving on,
something that you may not want to see, right?
Yeah.
But fortunately, we have Dr. Jonathan Larson, who's going to help guide us through tick season, right?
Oh, yes. I feel bad coming on after that. That was like a nice, beautiful piece of nature. And yeah, I'm going to present these blood-sucking little ninjas that hide out in our landscapes. So it is that time of year. We've had a lot of questions about ticks already this year. We have a lot of inquiries about getting ticks to us, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the end here. But just to start from the top, we do see a lot of ticks in the state, and I just wanted to sort of start from the top with how ticks work. Ticks are ectoparasites. That means that they feed on the outside of the body of their host, and they do this to lots of different organisms. We have hard-shelled ticks, and we have soft-shelled ticks. When we talk about those different species, the soft-shelled ones, they're the ones that we don't see on people nearly as often, but the hard-shelled ones we do, and they're all on the outside of these animals. So we see them on turkeys, we see them on elk, deer, dogs, horses, you name it. They'll also get on people. We are just as full of blood as all of those critters that are out in the woods, and so they're happy to take advantage of us if they could get it, just like Dracula would be if he could find you. So the other question that we get sort of about the basics of these things is, why are they drinking this blood? What is it that drives them to do that? And it's very simple. They need the blood meal in order to shed their exoskeleton and go to the next stage of life. So they do start as eggs, which you can see in the graph on the right there. The eggs are orbs that are usually all in sort of a gooey pile that the female will leave out in grassy areas to protect them from the sun. Those eggs are going to pop open and out will come a larval tick. Larval tick species or ticks only have 6 legs, which is different than the rest of their life when they're going to have 8 legs. They are arachnids. They're closely related to mites and then sort of closely related to spiders. So that's why they have those 8 legs, but they start out life with 6 for some reason. And then once they take a blood meal as a larva, they will shed that exoskeleton and go to the next stage, which is a nymph. The nymph is going to take another blood meal, and then they'll shed their exoskeleton again and become an adult. You can see there are some differences in the sexes. Males generally are smaller. They're less ornate on their back. Females tend to have markings on their back, like this Lone Star tick that we see here. So it's a little different than some of the other bloodsuckers that we see, people that deal with mosquitoes. If you haven't heard before, only female mosquitoes will bite humans and other animals to get that blood because they need it to produce their eggs. With these species, we're talking about an organism that has to have the blood throughout its life in order to even develop. So it's an interesting way of going about getting food, I think. And they're very adapted to it. This is just a little video that you can hopefully see moving that shows you how a tick bites you. They have a very niche mouth part, I will say. It is heavily adapted to do what they do. And at the tip, there are these little chelicera that have been modified into sort of a slicing knife-like organ. They will cut into the skin, and then they will insert their hypostome, which is a mouth part like you see on the right. It's got backward-facing spines. It's their spiky tongue, basically. And then that will penetrate into the skin and anchor them into place. They exude a saliva when they do this. The saliva is there to help them sort of pump your blood out and thin it, but it also is sort of a natural paste, and it will cement them into place, and they can remain attached to their host for 7 to 10 days if they're left undisturbed. They will feed that entire time that they're attached, and they can greatly expand their body from their original size. Ticks are generally pretty flat when they're unfed. They look kind of like a seed most of the time. They're about the same size as a seed, and they are pretty thin. Not paper thin, but still pretty thin in profile. But their body is able to expand many, many times its original size. They can go from what looks like a little sunflower seed to what looks like a grape, basically. They're very prodigious at this. You can see that big body on the far right here. That's after 8 days of sucking blood out of a host. If you've ever heard the phrase, "I'm as full as a tick," this is where it comes from, is this really weird ability to kind of expand their body. I like to joke that these are the newest flavor of fruit gushers, blood flavored, because if you pop these open, you will find lots and lots of red gooey blood in there. When I was getting ready for today, I just happened to be looking around for some different videos and things I thought about including. And there is a very popular subgenre of YouTube videos where people take ticks that they've discovered feeding on them, and then they inject them with hydrogen peroxide in order to get them to explode. It's a bit macabre, if you ask me, a bit cruel. I know they stole your blood, but it was pretty horrifying to watch. I don't necessarily recommend that. The final adaptation that I will mention that ticks have that make them very successful at their given role is that they can actually wait a long time between feedings. Ticks generally have an annual life cycle because they usually find enough things to eat, but individual ticks can live multiple years. Some of these species that we deal with, they can survive up to a year in between feedings. So if they're not able to locate a mouse or a turkey or a human or a horse in between these feedings, they can wait up to a year before they'll succumb to starvation. So all of these adaptations really add up to making nature's most successful ectoparasite group, I would argue. The ticks are the ones that do it the best, and that's not really great news for us, unfortunately. When you encounter ticks is going to be when you're outside, generally, just about anywhere. A lot of people think of this as kind of a rural problem. That is far from the truth. Ticks are just as likely to be in cities and towns as they are out in the country. Anywhere that there's kind of a shaded area with lots of tangled undergrowth, so anywhere that's near a path, typically, we see them in urban parks occasionally. If you go out and you're doing any brush removal, that's going to be prime tick habitat. They just don't want to be exposed to a lot of UV light. The other thing that people ask about ticks is like, how did they get onto me? How did they get onto my body? Some people have this conception that they kind of like wait up in trees and then parachute down and land on you that way. That would be a very tricky way of obtaining a host. The truth is that most ticks are at about knee or hip level for us. And when we walk through the brush, they're just at the tips of blades of grass, the tips of branches, and they have their arms stuck out in front of them in this questing behavior, which you can see kind of on the left here in motion. And then they're just going to grab a hold of whatever passes them by and clamber up their body. Once aboard, they do try to find a spot that has thinner skin. They will walk across you. They have a very light touch, as you can see on the right there. You generally don't know that this is happening until you discover the tick plugged into your skin. Sometimes you get lucky and they sort of trigger a hair on you and you may notice it. I know that one time after I got done in the field, I felt something weird in the bottom part of my beard, and I happened to reach up and I just pulled out a tick that it hadn't fed on me yet, but I got it kind of pulled out of my hair there. So sometimes we get lucky. Our pets are not as lucky. The animals in our lives, they generally can't stop the ticks from plugging into them. But with dogs and cats in particular, you'll usually find them on the head, in the ears, sometimes on the top of the back. They want those thinner skinned areas where there's plenty of blood vessels that they're going to get an easy meal. The tick behavior is wild out there. We have a graduate research assistant that works on ticks, and she's described lots of interesting scenarios to me. There's 3 species that we deal with in the state. The Lone Star ticks are the most common tick in our state according to our statewide survey. These are the ones that we capture the most and the ones that we have submitted the most. They can be more aggressive than the other ticks. I just mentioned this questing behavior, but these ones have been observed to actually sort of like follow you, kind of like The Walking Dead. They'll kind of clamor after you. If they can detect your CO2 and your body heat, they'll try to follow you to get on board. They are a little more common in wooded areas. They don't necessarily like to be out in big sunny spots. Like I mentioned, most ticks don't, but these ones, they're often sort of on the edge of these wooded areas. And the adults are active right now from April into August. And they do transmit quite a few things: ehrlichiosis, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Heartland virus, Starry, which is an associate of Lyme disease. And then these are most famous for being the vector, isn't quite the right word, but the vector for red meat allergy. They pass a sugar molecule into you, and then you can't eat hamburgers anymore afterwards, basically. So this is a very weird tick, one that seems to be becoming more popular in the state. The American dog tick is historically the most common tick, but it seems to have been supplanted. These are common on our pets, as the name implies. They're most often found in grassy areas, so long grassy areas next to paths and trails, also active April to August, have been observed to transmit Rocky Mountain spotted fever and tularemia, also known as rabbit fever. And then we have the blacklegged tick, or the deer tick. These are the ones that are associated with Lyme disease. The female there on the left has that kind of orange back end, and then the darker parts in the front. The male is a more uniform kind of brown color, if you look there on the right. These do feed mainly on white-tailed deer. They live in forests. They are active October to May on any day above freezing as adults. So it's always tick season in Kentucky. We truly are never free of the hazard of ticks. You need to be thinking about them pretty much any time that you're outside. And the reason people don't like this one is because they hold that pathogen that causes Lyme disease inside of them, which is on the rise in our state, unfortunately. You may have also heard about Asian longhorn tick. This is an invasive species. It has been detected in the state at least 5 times. I heard that there may have been a 6th find recently. I need to find out more information about that. I just heard it in passing when I was out and about in a different county. But these ones are invasive species introduced into New Jersey first. They've been found in Boone, Floyd, Madison, Martin, and Metcalfe counties that I know of. And this has all been on wildlife. They don't have any males in this country. In their native range, they have been observed to mate and actually reproduce through those normal kind of means. But here we've only found female ticks, and they reproduce asexually. They have huge populations that pop up on animals very quickly. We're not as worried about these for humans. They haven't been observed to vector any pathogens yet. And humans typically find ticks quickly and get them off of them. But our wildlife and our livestock aren't going to be able to do that. And we have seen cases of exsanguination where so many of these ticks have been found on animals that they bled to death into them, basically. So we are keeping a heavy eye out for this. We definitely want to know where it is in the state. It is weird looking compared to the other ticks for the lack of weirdness, basically. It has barely any markings on its body, and it just has these longer legs in the front. So if you see a weird looking tick, definitely take a picture of it, send it in to us. There are ways that you can sort of mail ticks in. You could talk to your local extension agent and see if they're willing to do that for you, but no promises there. It's just something that we do try to help with, but a picture says 1,000 words. So if you can get me a photograph, I'm usually able to identify it. For tick prevention, I always like to advocate for wearing protective clothing, which just in its sort of most basic sense means long pants and long sleeves. Use your effective repellents, and then wear permethrin treated clothing. I'll show some of that here in a second. But basically, it boils down to doing a tick check. I do a tick check very frequently, pretty much anytime that I come in from outside, whether I've been in the tree nursery, whether I've been out at a high tunnel, or if I've been out on a golf course doing work. I am looking for ticks because I know they're out there. I know they're looking for me. I definitely want to keep abreast of them. So check your hair, check in and around your ears, check under your arms, inside your belly button, around your waist, behind your knees, in your groin, everywhere that they mention in the country song, basically, about doing a tick check. And do that in the shower, do it on the toilet, any way that you can check those prone areas that the ticks like to get into. And do it for your animals as well. If there's a tick on your dog or your cat and it doesn't plug into them, but they jump up on your bed, you can end up with a tick in your bed. You'd be surprised about how many samples we have submitted like that. So always be cognizant that your animals are potential hosts too. Use those skin-based repellents like picaridin. You can use IR3535 or oil of lemon eucalyptus. The old standby is DEET. The more DEET there is in the container that you're using, the longer it lasts. But generally, you can go outside and use that 40% DEET and be protected even if you're just weeding for about 60 minutes or so outside. But if you're going to be doing more work in the landscape, it will help with chiggers. It helps with ticks and mosquitoes. If you're going deep in the woods, get the 100%. Do be aware that it can plasticize some things. It can ruin certain clothing items. Permethrin is another option. It's great for tick bite prevention, but it can only be applied to clothes or gear. You can buy permethrin in a spritz bottle like you see on the left, or you can buy impregnated clothing and use that to protect yourself. If you do find ticks, remove them from your body with pointy tweezers. Grab close to the skin surface with a pair of tweezers and then pull straight out. Don't use these tick twisters I've seen videos of where you like corkscrew the tick out of your skin. Absolutely horrifying to watch. A lot of potential there for pieces of the tick to break off in you, further leading to complications. Pull it straight up out of your skin. Don't yank it out. Don't wiggle it out. Just pull straight up and it will come out. It'll take some steady tugging, but it will come out eventually. When it's plugged into you, don't poke it with fire. Don't hit it with a cigarette. Don't pour alcohol on top of it or essential oils. Get it out of your skin first. Then if you want to torture, torment, or kill it, go ahead and curse it down to Hades. I don't care, but if you shouldn't do it when it's plugged into you, because that increases the likelihood they may sort of vomit into you, which increases the likelihood of pathogen transmission and therefore disease. I would also encourage you to keep the tick, maybe freeze it until a week or two has passed, so that if you do develop any sort of rashes at the bite site, if you develop a fever or body aches, then you can show the tick to your doctor and hopefully get some identification and some care after that. You may have heard through the news that we have a Submit a Tick program with UK Entomology Department. It is something that was started by our department chair, Dr. Subapali, and he is looking for ticks to come in so his graduate student can identify them and then test them for pathogens. So this is a service that's being offered for free. You can do it yourself. We're also going to be talking to extension agents about how to do this. They haven't received any instructions on this yet, and for that, I apologize. But we are going to give them some detailed information here this week. But it boils down to putting the tick in a Ziploc bag, soaking it overnight for about a day, I would say 24 hours, and 91% isopropyl alcohol, which you can find at the pharmacy. Then pour out the liquid that's left, put the tick and cotton ball into, keep them in that Ziploc, and then put that Ziploc bag in another Ziploc bag, and then put it in a harder box that you can send through the mail, just to make sure they don't get ground up by the Postal Service. This takes away flammable liquids. It makes sure that the tick is preserved and the DNA is secure inside of it for the testing, and it will keep it safe from the post office itself. So that was a real quick, there's also this form. I can show you where to get that here in a little bit if I still have time. But basically, it's a form that tells us your name, when you're sending this in, where did you get the tick, and then how many ticks did you find? Those are all very important pieces of information for us. Don't send us live ticks. Don't send us ticks wrapped up in tape. It has to be in this method if you want that information. This is me. I'm at Bugman John on Twitter if you ever have a question I can help with, or jonathan.larson@ukY.edu. Hope I didn't take up too much time, Renee.
No, you did great.
Perfect.
I'm kind of like
Never-
steamy right now, but
Well, I was when I started, I noticed the participant number just like dropping people. Like, I don't want to hear about this. Mussels are cool, but I don't want to be reminded of these gross bugs.
no, ticks. Yeah.
Yeah,
We know how to get rid of them
we
if we
need to
get
know.
them. Yes.
it's a tough time of year. You know, everybody's got cabin fever. They want to get outside. They want to get rearing and going. But these things are out there, and they seem to be becoming more and more common. And so we just want people to really protect themselves, keep themselves safe. Ticks are a problem. You need to take some steps to protect yourself and to check yourself afterwards.
You know, I noticed like when I was younger, I used to go up in the mountains and run around all the time, and I never had to worry about ticks. So
Yeah.
what's going on? Why are there so many now?
Well, that's the $1 million question, maybe even multi-million dollar question if you're looking at grants and things. If I were to sort of boil it down to what I have observed and what I've read the most about, it's about increases in populations of things like mice and deer, which are common hosts for these things. So we have more of those animals, therefore there's more things for the ticks to feed on, and their populations go up. There's also some talk about climate change impacting overgrowth areas. So those kind of weedy, like gnarly areas that we were talking about as habitat for them, there's more of that. You could also chalk that up to things like invasive species, perhaps creating more shady spots. But all of that leads to more blood, more areas to lay their eggs, and then that's going to lead to more ticks. So that's the sort of 1,000-foot view look at why we think there's more ticks now. Because you're right, I hear that all the time about, I used to go out there and I never worried about ticks, or there didn't seem to be all these diseases inside of them.
Right.
That's also true. We seem to be seeing more and more pathogens pop up with them. So
Looks like we're going to have to learn to live with them, right?
unfortunately, I wish I could offer a ray of sunshine and say something's going to wipe them out, but we're dealing with more. We're dealing with more of the aggressive species, that Lone Star one, and we're dealing with more of the black-legged deer tick in this state, which will mean more Lyme in the future. And Kentucky has a convoluted history with Lyme. We don't have time to get into, but traditionally not thought of as a Lyme state, which has impacted people's lives for a long period of time in Kentucky. And that attitude is slowly changing. So hopefully people get the medical care they need.
Okay.
So, Jonathan, is there anything good about ticks then? People ask me, is there some redeeming qualities in these creatures?
I get asked that a lot about a lot of insects. You could get really dark and say it's biocontrol for animals and people. You could say that. The truth is that they're a food resource for lots of things that are out there. There's a Facebook meme that goes around a lot that talks about how many ticks possums eat. I can't find like an actual scientific publication that shows that and verifies it, but maybe it's true that possums really love ticks, but I do know birds love to eat them. Chickens,
Dr. Matt Springer had said that possums love ticks.
Okay,
but I
well
don't
then,
know.
all right, and
Yeah.
he's the wildlife dude. I'm going to trust him on that. I will trust the Facebook meme now. But guinea fowl, chickens, they all love to eat them as well. So they're just a part of nature. Parasites, unfortunately, exist.
Exactly. Well, we appreciate your presentation. We really do.
Yeah,
Anytime.
yeah, helping all of our viewers out there stay safe, and a good reminder and plug for our county extension offices across the state as well. So thanks to all those agents doing all that great work out there.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Bye. All right. Jam-packed show.
No, man, the mussels with Dr. Haig were really cool. But the ticks, what, may creep you out a little bit. People need to know this stuff.
People need to know this
Need
stuff.
to be able to protect themselves. So big thanks to both our guests.
Right, definitely. And anytime, if you're coming in, oh, I've got a tick. How do I get that off of there? You can go to fromthewoodstoday.com and see his presentation and, scroll through a little bit at a time and try to figure out how to get that off of there without twisting him off.
Yeah, no corkscrewing, okay?
No corkscrewing.
Well, folks, thank y'all for being with us again this week. We really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next week.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
woods today.